March 15, 1967. Monument Valley, Utah. Frank Torino had loaded Dean Martin's gun with blanks 30 minutes before the cameras rolled. He'd done it 1,000 times before on 1,000 different sets. But when that Colt .45 fired and Dean Martin dropped to the desert sand, blood spreading across his shirt, Frank knew someone had switched his blanks for live rounds. John Wayne's face went white. Not from shock, from recognition. The Duke knew exactly who had done it, and why. What happened in the 10 minutes after the cameras stopped rolling was buried deeper than any script. Studio executives made phone calls, witnesses signed papers. The official story became gospel. For 57 years, Frank kept his mouth shut, until his granddaughter started asking questions about Hollywood's darkest secrets. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank Torino's weathered hands trembled as he reached for his morning coffee, the ceramic mug slipping slightly in his grip. At 80, his fingers weren't what they used to be, but it wasn't age making them shake this Tuesday morning in March 2024. It was the email glowing on his laptop screen, the one from his granddaughter, Casey. "Grandpa, I'm starting a documentary about Hollywood cover-ups in the 1960s. Studio corruption, mob connections, buried scandals. I know you worked on some big pictures back then. Can we talk?" The coffee tasted like ash in his mouth. 57 years of silence, and now his own blood was circling the truth like a vulture over carrion. Frank's small apartment in Burbank was a museum of Hollywood's golden age movie posters, signed photographs, prop guns, and display cases. The walls told the story of a career spent making fantasy look real, making blanks sound like bullets, making sure actors went home to their families every night. He'd been good at his job, the best, some said, except for that one day in Monument Valley when everything went to hell. His phone buzzed. Casey again. "Found some interesting stuff about the War Wagon production. Meeting with a source this afternoon who says there's more to Dean Martin's accident than the official story. Love you." Frank's blood turned to ice water. He fumbled for his reading glasses, scanning the message again. A source. Someone else who knew. After all these years, the secret was starting to bleed through the cracks like groundwater through a damaged foundation. He stumbled to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and stared at the stranger in the mirror. The man looking back had been handsome once, back when he wore leather tool belts and called movie stars by their first names. Now he looked like what he was, a keeper of ghosts, aged by secrets that had eaten him from the inside out. The memories came flooding back, unbidden. The weight of John Wayne's hand on his shoulder in the immediate aftermath. The Duke's voice, low and dangerous. "Frank, you didn't see nothing but an accident today. We clear?" The way Wayne's eyes had scanned the crew, cataloging faces, memorizing who had been close enough to notice the blood was real, the panic genuine. Frank remembered the studio executives arriving within hours, their black town cars kicking up red dust clouds as they descended on the location like carrion birds. Contracts appeared, non-disclosure agreements. Suddenly everyone on that crew had gotten very wealthy, very quickly, and very quiet. But someone was talking now. Someone with information about that day was meeting with his granddaughter. His hands found his old address book, pages yellow with age. Most of the names inside belonged to dead men, now grips and gaffers and stunt coordinators who'd taken Hollywood secrets to their graves, but not all of them. Frank flipped through the entries, his finger stopping on a name that made his chest tighten. Vincent Vinnie Torino, no relation, despite the shared surname. Vinnie had been a studio security chief back then, the kind of man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he'd helped dig the holes. If someone was talking about the War Wagon, Vinnie would know about it. Frank dialed the number, praying it was still good after all these years. "Yeah?" The voice that answered was gravelly, older, but still carried that edge of menace Frank remembered. "Vinnie, it's Frank Torino, the prop master." A long pause. "Jesus, Frank, thought you were dead." "Not yet. Listen, I need to know something. My granddaughter is asking questions about Monument Valley, about Dean Martin. Someone's feeding her information." Another pause, longer this time. Frank could hear Vinnie thinking, calculating. "You need to shut that down, Frank, right now, today. What aren't you telling me? The same thing I wasn't telling you 57 years ago. Some stones are better left unturned. Some people who thought this was buried are getting nervous. Very nervous. The line went dead. Frank stared at his phone, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. In 40 years of working with explosives and firearms, he'd developed a sixth sense for danger. That same instinct was screaming at him now. Casey was in trouble. She just didn't know it yet. He looked at the display case holding his collection of prop weapons, Colts and Winchesters and Derringers that had starred in dozens of films. All of them harmless now. Firing pins removed, barrels plugged, safe. Unlike the real world, where the bullets were always live and the people who fired them rarely missed. Frank reached for his coat. Whatever Casey had stumbled into, whatever she thought she was investigating, it was bigger and more dangerous than she could possibly imagine. The war wagon incident hadn't been about Dean Martin at all. It had been a message, a demonstration of power, a reminder that in Hollywood, some people could arrange accidents whenever they needed them. And if his granddaughter kept digging, she might just become the next accident on someone's list. Introduction. Frank's coat hung heavy on his shoulders as he stepped into the late morning sun, the March air carrying the familiar cocktail of smog and jasmine that defined Los Angeles. His hands had stopped shaking, but the tremor had moved inward, settling somewhere deep in his chest where fear lived. The parking garage beneath his building smelled of motor oil and concrete dust, reminding him of the sound stages where he'd spent the best years of his life. His Toyota Camry, 10 years old and reliable as sunrise, started on the first try. Frank had never been one for flash, even when the studio money was flowing. He'd seen what happened to men who drew too much attention to themselves in Hollywood. They ended up like extras in their own stories, easily written out when the script called for it. The drive to Sherman Oaks took 43 minutes in traffic, giving him too much time to think. Casey lived in a small apartment complex near the 405, the kind of place where young dreamers landed when they first arrived in the city with nothing but ambition and student loan debt. Frank had offered to help with rent more than once, but she was stubborn. Got that from her grandmother, God rest her soul. Elena had been dead 12 years now, and Frank still caught himself buying her favorite tea at the grocery store. She'd been the only person who knew pieces of the truth about Monument Valley. Not the whole story, never that, but enough to understand why Frank sometimes woke up screaming in the middle of the night. Elena had held him through those episodes without asking questions, her small hands strong enough to anchor him to the present when the past tried to drag him under. Casey was all he had left of that love. Elena's eyes in a 26-year-old face, bright with the same fierce curiosity that had made Elena such a good teacher. But curiosity was a dangerous trait in a family carrying Frank's particular burden. He pulled into the visitor parking space outside Casey's complex, a bland stucco building painted the color of wet sand. The courtyard held a kidney-shaped pool that had seen better decades and palm trees that dropped brown fronds like discarded promises. This was where dreams came to pay rent and wait for their big break. Through Casey's first-floor window, Frank could see the blue glow of her computer screen. She was always working. Freelance articles, documentary research, grant applications. She'd graduated from USC with a film degree in debt that would take a decade to pay off, but she had talent, real talent, the kind that asked the right questions and wouldn't let go until she found answers. That's what terrified him. Frank knocked on her door, 3 soft raps. "Casey, it's Grandpa." Humming, her voice carried that note of distracted enthusiasm he knew well. The door opened, and there she was, Elena's dark eyes and stubborn chin, her black hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing an oversized USC sweatshirt with coffee stains down the front. "Grandpa, perfect timing. I was just—" She stopped, studying his face. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Several of them, Frank thought but didn't say. Instead, he managed to smile. Can an old man visit his favorite granddaughter without drama? "I'm your only granddaughter." Casey stepped aside, letting him into the organized chaos of her apartment. Papers covered every surface. Printed articles, handwritten notes, photographs both old and new. Her laptop sat open on a folding table that served as her desk. Multiple browser tabs reflecting her research into Hollywood's darker corners. "I brought lunch," Frank lied, holding up empty hands. Or I thought I did. Maybe I left it in the car. Casey laughed, the sound bright enough to push back some of the darkness in Frank's chest. Nice try. There's leftover Chinese in the fridge. Want some? The apartment smelled like jasmine incense and coffee grounds, with an undertone of old books. Casey had always been a reader, even as a little girl. Frank remembered taking her to the library when she was 8, watching her disappear into the stacks for hours. She'd emerge with armfuls of biographies and history books, stories about real people doing real things. Even then, she'd been more interested in truth than fantasy. Actually, I wanted to talk about your project, Frank said, settling onto her second-hand couch. The cushions sagged under his weight, springs singing a tired song. This documentary you mentioned. Casey's eyes lit up, and Frank felt his heart clench. She perched on the edge of her desk chair, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who'd found her calling. It's going to be incredible, Grandpa. I've been digging into studio archives, and there are all these stories that never made it into the official histories. Payoffs, intimidation, accidents that weren't really accidents. Sounds dangerous, Frank said quietly. Dangerous how? These are just old stories. Most of the people involved are dead. Not all of them, Frank thought, remembering Vinny's voice on the phone. Not nearly all of them. She glanced at the screen, frowning. Unknown number. Should I? Let it go to voicemail, Frank said quickly, but Casey was already answering. Hello? This is Casey. Her expression shifted, eyebrows rising with interest. Yes, I sent that email yesterday. You have information about the war wagon? She grabbed a pen, mouthing sorry to Frank as she scribbled notes. Tonight? That's pretty short notice, but... Okay. The Formosa Cafe at 8. How will I recognize you? Frank's blood turned to ice. The Formosa Cafe, a Hollywood institution where deals were made and secrets traded over martinis. He'd been there himself years ago, when studio executives needed to have conversations that couldn't happen on lot. Gray hair, black jacket, sitting at the bar, Casey repeated into the phone. Got it. And you'll bring documentation? A pause. Photos from the set? Mr. Castellano, this could be exactly what I need for... The line went dead. Casey stared at her phone, then looked up at Frank with eyes shining with excitement. Grandpa, this is it. This is the break I've been waiting for. Someone named Tony Castellano says he was there that day Dean Martin got shot. He has pictures that were never released, evidence that, no. The word came out harder than Frank intended. Absolutely not. Casey blinked. What do you mean, no? Frank struggled to keep his voice calm. I mean, it's not safe. Meeting strangers in bars, chasing stories about old accidents. It wasn't an accident. Casey's voice carried a certainty that made Frank's chest tighten. I've been reading the incident reports, the insurance claims. Nothing adds up. The official story says Martin was hit by a ricochet during a rehearsal, but there are witness statements that contradict. Casey. Frank leaned forward, his hands gripping his knees. Some stories aren't meant to be told. Since when? She stood up, pacing to her window. You're the one who taught me that truth matters. You used to say that lies were like faulty props. Eventually they break down and someone gets hurt. The irony wasn't lost on him. Frank had built his life on a lie so fundamental that its collapse would destroy everything he'd tried to protect. This is different. How? Frank opened his mouth to answer, but found himself staring at Casey's research wall. Photos of John Wayne, Dean Martin, movie stills from the war wagon. And there, pinned among the articles and notes, was something that made his blood freeze. A photograph, black and white, slightly blurry, showing the moment right after the shooting. Frank remembered when it was taken. He could see himself in the background, his face white with shock. But someone had circled a figure standing near the craft services table, barely visible in the crowd. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Where did you get this? Frank whispered, pointing at the photo. That one? It came in the mail yesterday. No return address, just a note saying I might find it interesting for my research. Casey pulled the photo down, examining it. I've been trying to identify everyone in the shot. Do you recognize anyone? Frank's hands were shaking again. The circled figure was Vincent Torino, but this wasn't the Vinny he'd spoken to on the phone an hour ago. This was a younger Vinny, one who was supposed to have been in Los Angeles that day handling studio business. not standing 20 feet away from what was supposed to look like an accident. "Grandpa, you're scaring me." Frank realized he'd been holding his breath. Someone had sent Casey this photo. Someone wanted her to see Vinny at the scene, which meant someone knew the truth about Monument Valley and was using his granddaughter to expose it. The photograph felt like a loaded gun in his trembling hands. After 57 years of silence, the past was reaching out with skeletal fingers, demanding its due. Frank had always known this day might come, had rehearsed a dozen different scenarios in his mind, but he'd never imagined it would arrive through Casey's mailbox, gift-wrapped in anonymous conspiracy. "Don't go tonight," Frank said quietly. "Please." "Why?" "Grandpa, what aren't you telling me?" Before Frank could answer, Casey's laptop chimed with a new email notification. She glanced at the screen, and Frank watched her face change, watched excitement replace confusion. "It's from the same address that sent this photo," she said, clicking open the message. "He says, oh my God, he says he has the hospital records from when they brought Dean Martin in that night. The real ones, not the sanitized versions that made it into the official file." Frank closed his eyes. The hospital records. If they still existed, if someone had kept copies all these years, they would show what Frank had spent decades trying to forget. The entry wound hadn't been consistent with a ricochet. Everyone there that night had known it, but the money had flowed and the silence had held. Until now. Neither choice would save her. "Casey, listen to me." Frank stood up, his knees protesting. "You need to delete that email. Delete all of this. Tell whoever sent it that you're not interested." "Are you insane?" Casey's voice rose, and Frank heard Elena in it, the same tone his wife had used when she thought he was being unreasonable. "Grandpa, this is the story of a lifetime. Someone's been covering up what really happened to Dean Martin for over 50 years, and now they're ready to talk." "They're not ready to talk," Frank said quietly. "They're ready to use you." Casey stared at him, her excitement faltering. "What does that mean?" Before Frank could answer, his phone buzzed. Text message from a number he didn't recognize. "Tell her to stop digging. Final warning." Frank's blood turned to sand in his veins. They were watching. They knew he was here, knew he was trying to talk Casey out of the meeting, which meant they'd been monitoring his granddaughter's communications, tracking her research, waiting for the right moment to surface. "Grandpa?" Casey was studying his face. "You're white as a sheet." Frank deleted the message with trembling fingers, but the words had already burned themselves into his memory. Final warning. In Hollywood's golden age, final warnings came with bullets attached. "I need to make a phone call," Frank said, moving toward Casey's kitchen. "Don't check any more emails, don't answer your phone, just give me 5 minutes." He dialed a number from memory, one he'd hoped never to use again. It rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. Mickey Torino's office. Not Mickey himself, never Mickey directly, but his assistant, a woman whose voice carried the weight of unspoken threats. "This is Frank Torino. I need to speak with Mickey. It's about Monument Valley." A pause that stretched like taut wire. "Hold, please." Frank pressed the phone against his ear, listening to dead air while Casey rustled through papers in the next room. Through her kitchen window, he could see the apartment complex's parking lot, noting which cars belonged and which didn't. An old habit from the studio days, when survival meant knowing who was watching. Frank, Mickey Torino's voice hadn't changed much in 20 years. Still smooth as aged whiskey, still carrying that undertone of violence barely held in check. "Heard you might be having family troubles. My granddaughter doesn't know anything," Frank said quickly. "She's just a kid making a documentary. She doesn't understand what she's stepping into. Smart kid, though, asking smart questions, finding smart sources." Frank's grip tightened on the phone. Mickey Torino wasn't related to Frank or Vinny despite the shared name. He was something worse, a studio fixer who'd graduated from covering up affairs and drunk driving arrests to handling more permanent problems. If Mickey was involved, it meant the stakes were higher than Frank had imagined. "Call it off," Frank whispered. "Whatever you're planning, call it off. I'll handle Casey. Will you?" Mickey's laugh was soft and cold. "Because from where I sit, it looks like she's handling you. Meeting with sources tonight, collecting evidence, building a case. That doesn't sound like someone who's been handled." Through the kitchen doorway, Frank could see Casey bent over her laptop, typing furiously. probably transcribing the hospital records, or researching Tony Castellano, or digging deeper into the very conspiracy that was now threatening to swallow them both. "She won't go to the meeting," Frank said. "I'll make sure of it." "How? By telling her the truth about what really happened in Monument Valley, about who ordered Dean Martin shot and why." Frank closed his eyes. Even now, after all these years, hearing it said aloud made his chest constrict. Dean Martin hadn't been the target that day. He'd been the message, a demonstration for John Wayne, showing him what happened to movie stars who forgot their place in the larger scheme of things. "She's my granddaughter," Frank said. "She's innocent. Nobody's innocent in this business, Frank. You should know that better than anyone. You've been carrying blood money for 57 years. The line went dead. Frank stood in Casey's narrow kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of a Young Life takeout containers and coffee cups, a calendar marked with deadlines and bill due dates. Normal problems, the kind of troubles that could be solved with time and money instead of silence and graves. From the living room came the sound of Casey's printer working, churning out documents she'd never lived to publish if Frank couldn't find a way to stop this. He walked back to find her holding a stack of papers, her eyes bright with discovery. "Grandpa, look at this. The anonymous source just sent me insurance photos from Dean Martin's hospital stay. The bullet trajectory doesn't match anything in the official report. This wasn't a ricochet. Someone shot him deliberately." Frank stared at the photos in her hands, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. The truth was finally coming home. Frank took the photos from Casey's hands, his fingers trembling as he recognized images he'd hoped never to see again. The hospital shots were clinical, stark. Dean Martin's shoulder wound photographed from multiple angles, measurements carefully noted in white ink. But Frank's eyes went to the trajectory diagrams, arrows showing the bullet's path through flesh and bone. "Casey, where exactly did these come from?" "Same anonymous email. But look at this one." She pulled out a photo showing Dean Martin on the hospital gurney, his face pale but alert. You can see he's talking to someone off camera. The timestamp says this was taken an hour after the shooting, but according to the studio's official report, he was unconscious from blood loss. Frank's chest tightened. He remembered that conversation because he'd been ordered to witness it. Dean Martin, despite the pain medication, had been lucid enough to understand the choice being presented, call it an accident and live, or tell the truth and join the other Hollywood figures who'd suffered fatal mishaps when they forgot their place. "The source says he has audio recordings too," Casey continued, her excitement building dangerously. "From the hospital room. Security cameras that everyone assumed were broken." "Jesus Christ." Frank sank onto her couch, the photos scattering across his lap. If audio existed from that night, it would contain Mickey Torino's voice making the threat explicit. It would prove that Dean Martin had been shot as a warning to John Wayne about his growing independence from studio control. Most damaging of all, it would reveal Frank's own voice agreeing to the cover-up in exchange for his family's safety. "We have to call the police," Casey said, pacing now with manic energy. "This is evidence of attempted murder, maybe conspiracy. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to—" "Stop." Frank's voice cut through her words like a blade. "Casey, sit down." Something in his tone made her freeze. For the first time since he'd arrived, Frank saw uncertainty flicker across her face. "Grandpa, what's wrong? Why aren't you excited about this? This is proof that everything we thought we knew about that day was a lie." Frank gathered the photos with hands that felt ancient, each image a weight that threatened to crush what was left of his soul. 57 years of silence, 57 years of carrying blood money, as Mickey had put it. Elena had known something terrible had happened in Monument Valley. She'd seen it in his nightmares, felt it in the way he'd flinch whenever the war wagon played on television. But she'd never pushed for details, trusting that Frank's silence protected them both. Now that silence was killing his granddaughter by degrees. "The day Dean Martin was shot," Frank began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I was the prop master. I was responsible for every weapon on that set." Casey settled into her desk chair, sensing the gravity of what was coming. "I know, Grandpa. You told me about working on westerns, about how careful you had to be with blanks, and—" There were no blanks that day. The words came out like broken glass. Someone had loaded live ammunition into one of the rifles. Real bullets, meant to kill. The apartment went silent except for the hum of Casey's laptop and the distant sound of traffic. Frank watched understanding dawn in her eyes, watched her excitement transform into something colder and more terrible. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew it wasn't an accident." "I knew more than that." Frank's hands were shaking so badly now that he had to set the photos aside. "I knew it was going to happen. Not exactly when, not exactly how, but I knew someone was planning to send John Wayne a message. The studio was losing control of their biggest star, and they needed him reminded of who really held the power." Casey's face had gone pale. "Are you saying you were part of it?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Frank closed his eyes, seeing Monument Valley again, the red rocks, the endless sky, and Dean Martin lying in the dirt while cameras rolled and crew members screamed. John Wayne's face had been pure shock, but Frank had seen something else there too, understanding. The Duke had known immediately that this wasn't an accident, had realized in that moment just how far the studio would go to maintain control. "I was supposed to switch the rifles," Frank said. "Make sure the live rounds were in the gun aimed away from Dean. But someone else got to the weapons first. When the shooting started, I realized they'd changed the plan." "Changed it how?" "They wanted Dean Martin hit. Not killed, the angle was wrong for that, but wounded badly enough to make the point, and they wanted me to watch, to understand what happened to people who couldn't be trusted to keep their mouths shut." Casey stood up abruptly, backing away from him. "Oh my God. Grandpa, are you telling me you helped cover up an attempted murder?" Frank looked at his granddaughter, Elena's eyes in a face he'd watched grow from infant sweetness to adult determination, and felt his heart break completely. "Yes," he whispered. "And now they want to kill you for finding out." "You're lying," she whispered. "You're trying to scare me away from the story." Frank wished that were true. God, how he wished he could be the man she'd always believed him to be. Instead, he pulled out his wallet with trembling fingers and extracted a yellowed business card that he'd carried for 57 years like a splinter in his soul. The card was simple, elegant Vincent Torino, Studio Relations. Below that, in pencil and Frank's own handwriting, Elena Kindergarten, Roosevelt Elementary. "They gave me this the day after the shooting," Frank said, holding up the card. "Your grandmother's schedule, where she worked, what time she walked home, which route she took to the grocery store. They wanted me to understand that my silence had a price, and my family would pay it if I ever forgot." Casey stared at the card as if it were radioactive. That's Grandma Elena's information. 26 years old and pregnant with your father. They knew everything about her, Casey. Everything about us." The message was clear: keep quiet about Monument Valley or lose everything that mattered. "So you chose to protect a bunch of criminals." Casey's voice cracked with betrayal. "You chose them over justice. I chose your grandmother over Dean Martin." The words tasted like poison, but Frank forced them out. "I chose your father's life over Hollywood's reputation, and I'd make the same choice again." The laptop chimed with another email. Both of them looked at the screen, but neither moved to check it. Frank already knew what it would say. Another breadcrumb in the trail someone was laying for Casey. Another piece of evidence designed to pull her deeper into a conspiracy that would end with her death. "The anonymous source," Casey said slowly, her journalist's mind working despite her emotional turmoil. "It's one of them, isn't it? One of the people who were there that day, probably." Frank stood up, his old bones protesting. "Someone who wants the truth to come out but doesn't want to be the one telling it. Someone who thinks they can use you to expose what happened without getting their own hands dirty." "Use me how?" Frank walked to the window and peered down at the parking lot. The same cars as before, but something felt different. A sedan with tinted windows that he'd dismissed earlier now seemed positioned too perfectly, with clear sight lines to Casey's building. Professional surveillance, the kind that turned fatal without warning. "They're going to feed you just enough truth to make you dangerous," Frank said, still watching the street. "Then they'll arrange for you to have an accident before you can publish. Your documentary dies with you, the evidence disappears, and whoever sent those emails emerges as the sole survivor with clean hands." Casey's laptop chimed again. This time she moved toward it instinctively, then stopped herself. "How do you know so much about how they operate?" The question Frank had been dreading. The one that would complete Casey's education in exactly who her grandfather really was, because it's not the first time. The words fell into silence like stones into still water. Casey turned toward him slowly, her face already preparing for the next revelation. "There were others?" she whispered. "Other people who found out about Monument Valley?" Frank nodded, unable to trust his voice. 3 others over the years, a freelance photographer in 1973 who'd gotten too close to the hospital records, a studio archivist in 1989 who'd asked the wrong questions about missing insurance files, and Casey's own journalism professor just 5 years ago, a man who'd been encouraging her to investigate old Hollywood scandals until he'd suffered a sudden heart attack at age 42. "Professor Morrison," Casey breathed, reading his face. "That's why you didn't want me to finish his research. That's why you tried to talk me out of the documentary. David Morrison was a good man who cared about his students too much for his own good." Frank's voice was hollow. "He sent me a letter before he died, said he was worried about the questions you were asking. Said someone had approached you about Monument Valley specifically." "Someone approached me?" Casey's eyes widened. "When? I never—" She stopped. Frank watched understanding dawn like a cold sunrise. "The grant," she whispered. "The anonymous grant that funded my documentary. $50,000 from a film preservation foundation that doesn't return phone calls." Frank felt the trap closing around them both. Someone had been orchestrating Casey's investigation from the beginning, feeding her just enough resources and information to make her feel like she was discovering the truth on her own. And Frank, in his desperation to protect her, had walked straight into their web. Casey's phone buzzed with a text message. She looked at it, and Frank saw her face go white. "What does it say?" Casey held up the phone with shaking hands. "Your grandfather is more involved than he's telling you. Ask him about the second shooter." "There was no second shooter," he said quietly. But Casey was already stepping away from him again. "Don't lie to me anymore, Grandpa. Please, I can't—" Her voice broke. "I can't take any more lies." Frank sank back onto the couch, suddenly feeling every one of his 83 years. Through the window, the sedan with tinted windows had been joined by a van parked across the street. They were running out of time, and the truth, all of it, was the only weapon he had left. There was supposed to be a second shooter, he said. Someone positioned to take out John Wayne if the warning with Dean Martin didn't work, if Wayne decided to fight back, to go public with what he knew about studio corruption. Casey's laptop chimed again, but she ignored it this time, her attention fixed entirely on Frank's face. Who was it? Who was the second shooter? The answer came out like a confession at his deathbed: me. The word hung in the air between them, transforming the shabby apartment into something that felt like a tomb. Frank watched his granddaughter's face cycle through disbelief, horror, and finally a kind of sick understanding. "They didn't just want you to switch the rifles," she whispered. "They wanted you to be ready to kill John Wayne. If necessary, yes." Frank's hands were shaking so badly now he had to clasp them together. "I had a clear sightline from the equipment truck. A hunting rifle with a scope, loaded and ready. Vincent Torino told me it was insurance that Wayne would see Dean Martin get shot and understand the message, and that would be the end of it. But you didn't pull the trigger. Wayne was smarter than they expected. The moment Dean went down, Wayne didn't try to be a hero. He didn't demand answers or threaten to expose anyone. He just knelt beside Dean and played his part, the shocked friend, the loyal co-star. He understood the game." Casey moved to her desk chair and sat down heavily, her hands pressed against her temples. "So you've been living with this for almost 60 years, knowing you were ready to commit murder." "Knowing I would have committed murder," Frank corrected. "If Wayne had made the wrong choice, if he'd tried to turn that set into a crime scene instead of a movie set, I would have killed him. To protect Elena, to protect your father, to protect the family I loved more than any principle or moral code." The laptop chimed again, and this time Casey glanced at it reflexively. Frank saw her face change as she read whatever message had just arrived. "What is it?" "Photos," she said, her voice distant and strange. "Photos of you on the equipment truck that day. You can see the rifle in your hands, see you tracking John Wayne through the scope." Frank closed his eyes. Someone had been documenting everything from the beginning, probably Vincent Torino, creating an insurance policy of his own, evidence to ensure that everyone involved remained committed to the cover-up. "There's something else," Casey continued, her journalist's instincts overriding her emotional turmoil. "A message. It says the photos will be released to the press in 24 hours unless we meet tonight at the location specified." "What location?" Casey's face had gone white again. "The Chinese Theater, the spot where John Wayne's handprints are in the cement. Midnight." Frank felt the trap snapping shut. The Chinese Theater public, enough to seem safe, symbolic enough to make the point clear. Someone wanted to end this where it had really begun, in the heart of Hollywood's mythology, where legends were created and destroyed with equal precision. "We're not going," he said firmly. "Casey, pack a bag. We're leaving Los Angeles tonight. We can't run from this, Grandpa." Casey stood up, and Frank saw something in her posture that reminded him painfully of Elena in her younger days, that same stubborn determination that made compromise impossible. "If we don't show up, they'll release everything anyway. Your photos, the hospital recordings, all of it. The story will come out, but we won't be alive to control how it's told. And if we do show up, maybe we can finally end this. Maybe we can—" Casey's phone rang, cutting off her words. The caller ID showed only a number, but Frank recognized the area code from his 40 years in the industry. A Hollywood number. Old Hollywood money. "Answer it," he said quietly. "Put it on speaker." Casey's hand trembled as she accepted the call. "Miss Torino." The voice was smooth, cultured, and completely unfamiliar. Not Mickey, not Vincent, but someone else. Someone who had been watching from the shadows while others did the dirty work. "I believe it's time we had a conversation." "Who is this?" Casey's voice was steadier than Frank expected, though he could see the tremor in her hands. "Someone who knew your grandfather when he was younger and considerably more useful." A soft chuckle carried through the speaker. "Frank, I trust you're listening? I'm here." Frank's throat felt like sandpaper. The accent was East Coast money, Yale or Harvard, the kind of pedigree that had colonized Hollywood in the 50s when Wall Street discovered the entertainment industry's profit potential. "Excellent. Then you'll understand why this conversation is long overdue." Papers rustled in the background, the sound of someone reviewing files with clinical detachment. "Your granddaughter has been quite resourceful, I must say, though I suspect you've filled in the gaps we left for her to discover." Casey shot Frank a look that could have cut glass. Even now, learning that her investigation had been orchestrated from the beginning, her journalist's instincts demanded answers. "You've been manipulating my research from the start. The grant, the anonymous sources, all of it. Manipulation is such an ugly word, Miss Torino. I prefer to think of it as guidance. You wanted to uncover Hollywood's buried secrets, and we provided you with the tools to do exactly that. The truth about Monument Valley was always going to surface eventually. Better that it emerge under circumstances we could control." Frank felt something cold settle in his chest. "What do you want, Whitmore?" The silence that followed confirmed Frank's guess. He'd recognized the voice at last. Charles Whitmore III, whose grandfather had been one of the studio system's founding financiers and whose family trust still held controlling interests in half of Hollywood's legacy properties. Whitmore had been young in 1967, probably fresh out of business school and learning the family trade from men like Vincent Torino. "Very good, Frank. Your memory remains admirably sharp." Whitmore's tone suggested genuine pleasure. "What I want is quite simple, the completion of a story that began 57 years ago. The principals are all dead now, Wayne, Dean Martin, even Vincent. You and I are the last witnesses to what really happened in Monument Valley. And Casey?" Frank's voice carried all the menace an 83-year-old man could summon. "Your granddaughter represents the future, Frank. A new generation of storytellers who understand that truth is simply another form of entertainment. Her documentary will be quite remarkable, I think, especially with the materials we've prepared for her." Casey leaned toward the phone. "I'm not making propaganda for you. Whatever you think you can blackmail us into—" "Blackmail?" Whitmore sounded genuinely offended. "My dear girl, you misunderstand entirely. We're offering you the scoop of a lifetime. The real story of John Wayne's greatest performance, not on screen, but on a desert film set where he chose survival over heroism. The moment America's cowboy proved he was just another actor taking direction." Frank saw the trap's true dimensions now. They didn't want the story buried. They wanted it told, but told their way. Wayne's image destroyed posthumously, the studio system's darkest methods revealed as historical curiosity rather than ongoing conspiracy, and Casey as the unwitting narrator of Hollywood's version of the truth. "The meeting tonight," Frank said. "What happens there? You return certain items that belong to U.S. photographs, recordings, documents that Vincent was careless enough to let survive. In exchange, we provide Miss Torino with a complete archive of material about Monument Valley. Enough evidence to make her documentary the definitive account of that day. Evidence that supports your version of events. Evidence that supports the truth, Frank, which is that you were a good man caught in an impossible situation who made the only choice that would protect his family. Quite sympathetic, really. Very human." Casey stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. "And if we refuse? Then tomorrow's entertainment news will lead with a different story. Elderly prop master confesses to John Wayne assassination plot. I'm afraid that version would be considerably less flattering to your grandfather's memory." Frank watched his granddaughter stare down at the street, her shoulders rigid with barely controlled fury. He'd spent 57 years believing he was protecting her from this moment, only to deliver her directly into it through his own cowardice. "There's a third option," Frank said quietly. Whitmore's laugh was genuinely delighted. "Oh, Frank, at your age, what exactly do you imagine you can do that Vincent Torino couldn't accomplish in his prime? I can tell the truth, all of it, including the parts you don't want Casey to know." The line went silent except for the faint hum of expensive electronics. When Whitmore spoke again, his cultured tone had acquired an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Midnight, Frank. The Chinese Theater. Don't disappoint me again." The call ended, leaving Frank and Casey alone with the weight of 57 years of silence and the terrible certainty that their reckoning had finally arrived. "We have 5 hours," Casey said without turning around. Her voice carried a flatness that worried Frank more than tears would have. "We're not going. You keep saying that." She faced him then, and Frank saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten, the look of someone who had just understood that the world was not the place she thought it was. "But we both know we don't have a choice. They've been planning this for years, maybe decades. They let me think I was investigating, but I was just following their script." Frank struggled to his feet, his joints protesting every movement. 83 years old, and still trying to protect his family from consequences that had been set in motion before Casey was born. "There's always a choice. We can disappear, change our names, leave California, and live the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders." Casey moved to her desk and began gathering the documents they'd spread across its surface. "They found me once, Grandpa. They'll find me again. At least this way, maybe I can control how the story gets told. You can't control men like Whitmore. They've had 60 years to perfect this game." Casey paused in her organizing, holding a photograph of John Wayne from that last day of filming. In it, the Duke looked older than his 59 years, his eyes holding knowledge that the camera couldn't quite capture. "Maybe. But I'm not the scared girl who started this investigation 6 months ago, and you're not the same man who kept quiet about Monument Valley." Frank felt something shift in his chest, not quite hope, but the absence of the crushing despair that had lived there since Elena's death. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Whitmore made one mistake." Casey's voice carried the first hint of her old determination. "He told us what he wants. He needs us at the Chinese Theater to complete whatever story he's been crafting. That gives us leverage, or it makes us sitting ducks. Maybe both." Casey sat on the edge of her desk, studying Frank with new eyes. "Tell me about the items he wants back, the things Vincent was careless enough to let survive." Frank had hoped they wouldn't get to this part, the final secret, the one that had kept him awake for 57 years. "Insurance," he said quietly. "Vincent didn't trust the studio bosses any more than they trusted him. He documented everything, not just my assignment, but theirs too. Recordings of planning meetings, photographs of money changing hands, even film footage of the Monument Valley setup." "Film footage?" Casey straightened. "You mean there's actual video of what happened that day?" Vincent had cameras positioned around the set that he claimed were for security purposes. Really, he was collecting evidence against everyone involved. If the studio tried to eliminate him, those materials were set to be released to every newspaper in the country. Casey was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. Where are they now, these materials? Frank looked toward the window, where the surveillance vehicles were still visible in the parking lot below. Elena hid them. After Vincent died in that car accident in 1972, someone broke into our house looking for them. She moved everything to a safety deposit box and never told me where, said it was better if I didn't know. But she told someone, your father. Frank's voice was barely a whisper. Right before the cancer took her, she gave him the key and made him promise to keep the secret, to never let anyone know what we'd been part of. Casey stood abruptly, pacing to the window again. Frank watched her profile as she stared down at the street, her mind working through possibilities he couldn't see. The surveillance cars remained in position, but something about their placement had changed, more professional, more final. Dad never said anything, she murmured. Even after you told me about Monument Valley, he never... She stopped, her hand pressed against the glass. The safety deposit box. It's still there, isn't it? Frank nodded. After Elena's funeral, neither he nor Casey's father had been able to bring themselves to deal with the contents. The box remained untouched, its secrets gathering dust in a downtown bank vault. Then we have what Whitmore wants. Casey turned from the window, and Frank saw something in her expression that reminded him of Vincent Torino in his prime, the look of someone who had just realized they held better cards than their opponents suspected. And maybe, just maybe, we have enough to finally tell the truth on our own terms. Outside, the sun was setting behind the Hollywood Hills, painting the sky the color of old blood.